for those families who do want to leave a legacy, to leave a family behind which is strong, loving, in which any wealth you do pass on to your children leaves them stronger, leaves them more empowered to start families of their own, leaves them more empowered to continue the charitable work that's important to you, to continue the strength of the family business. I want to give you the concepts to reason about that. I want to point you to the examples, the historic families in both the UK, in European history, and indeed in American history. Some of the great heroes of the book are of the American Protestant tradition, so that you can decide what the right path is for you. And ultimately, the concluding of the chapter really dives into this question of what legacy is, because I think that central question is also one that has been crippled by an impoverished discourse. So it's really about going back to fundamentals, anchoring it in the Christian tradition, in Christendom, in our mutual history, and allowing family leaders who are looking at what to do with their legacy and how to involve their children in it, the reasoning skills to do that in a way that makes sense to them.
Yeah, I appreciate that, because it really does have to go back to fundamentals. As we've both pointed out, throughout history, the core purpose for existence in most societies was having a lot of children and being able to pass things down to them. That's kind of the whole reason you did what you did. That was a motivating factor. Now, some of this is rhythm of life stuff, right? Like you had to kind of have children if you were married, if you were being intimate, that was going to happen. There weren't other options. You needed those tighter knit family units to survive. People had a much harder time being on their own. Multi-generational housing, neighborhoods, cares inside of clans or churches, these kind of things were far more common and necessary for survival. You didn't have the option of moving across the country and living on your own. You really did need to have that support, that multi-generational support of the family. And so I think a lot of those things came more instinctually when you don't have other options, right? It was just, this is how we live. This is the only way we can live. And so therefore we will live that way. And so in so many ways, opportunity and options are the enemy of, wisdom and tradition, because they give you the possibility of kind of blowing those things up for a while without really feeling the consequences. But maybe we should lay out first why that ultimately fell away. Why did we go from societies that were deeply grounded in this idea that we needed to pass it on? And I think a lot of it is Christian. Of course, we need to be, as Christians, we definitely want to ground it in that theology. But obviously, we can see this trend across many different societies, those which are not Christian as well. This is just the way humans live throughout most of history. So what is it about this transition into modernity that has broken that chain of being, that chain of tradition between the old to the young, where we all felt that duty to each other and would have, kind of gone through the task that you're discussing in a very natural way most of the time?
I think the two main things that have changed in response to that question are charity and how we conceive of charity, and people's estates, so what they would be leaving to their children. To take the second one first, people's estates used to be very illiquid objects that brought with them duties as well as responsibilities. So they were the family business. In 1890, something like 90% of Americans were either small agrarian farmers themselves or were employed by a family member on a family farm. And so when you pass that on, when that is the wealth that you pass on to your children, you are indeed making them richer in some abstract sense. You're handing them something of tremendous value, but it is necessarily something that isn't going to corrupt them, because it demands work of them. It demands stewardship. It demands cultivation. So you're giving them duties, responsibilities, seniority, stewardship, as well as wealth. Now we live in a highly financialized economy where a lot of people ultimately are able to pass on wealth in a form that brings none of those obligations. So if you look at the aristocracy equally of history, it's true that they didn't have to work in the same sense, but they were passing on estates which required management, which brought duties of the provision of security, the flourishing of the families and the communities that lived on their estates. They had obligations to host, to care for elderly relatives, to sustain the artistic and spiritual flourishing of the community more broadly. So again, even in this elite, sort of ultra high net worth aristocratic tradition, there is a version of this as well. Now, I don't think that's true. I think that a lot of people are in a situation where it is quite normal to accrue wealth through starting a business or rising up in a business and then liquidating your business, selling it, going to IPO, selling it to venture capital. and then ending up in a situation where at the end of your life or at a certain point in your life, when you're thinking about what to leave to your children, basically everything you have is quite liquid. It doesn't bring obligations. And so you are confronted with this question of, well, if I just dump a lot of cash in the lap of my 35-year-old son, is that not the equivalent of making a sort of lottery winner of him? And lottery winners tend to have very poor life outcomes because that liquid cash injection immediately robs them of purpose. It provides this huge wave of temptation towards idleness. It gives them these great questions because it suddenly shifts them in the trajectory of their life from one path in which they had a vision of where they were going to one in which they need to rethink everything from fundamentals. So it's quite a dislocating experience. And I think people rightly intuit that is a path that brings significant risks. So then they think, well, I'll leave enough for my child to go to college or whatever it is, but really I should be doing something that I can have more confidence will have positive effects. And that's where I think we come to the other thing, which is charity. Now, charity in Christendom, prior to the 19th and prior to the 20th century, charity in really every major Christian tradition was conceived of as a virtue. So it was much broader than just charity as giving money or giving resources to an institution. It was a diverse expression of this fundamental capacity of love. So charity is from the Latin caritas, which is the translation of the biblical Greek agape. And both of these are different characterizations, expressions of love. And so how charity is instantiated in sort of classic Christianity takes on multiple forms. It is true that it takes on almsgiving, so that's the giving of wealth to people in need and the giving of material goods, but it also has these diverse expressions, anything really that can be encapsulated by wanting what is best for your brother as a result of recognizing him as an aspect of God's creation due to your fundamental love of God. So an equally valid expression of charity can be sort of chastisement. It can be fraternal correction, going to a man who's living in sin and challenging him, and saying that's every bit as charitable as a financial donation. What I think happened and where these two trends intersect is you see with the rise of philanthropy in the States, this kind of competing movement. And there are various things that underpin this. One was the rise of the sort of Gilded Age magnates, men like Andrew Carnegie, who had this tremendous amount of wealth, but whose Christian sureness was on increasingly tenuous footing. He didn't go to church much. There was a slight commitment, but he was definitely not a Christian first and foremost. And they had this question of what to do with their wealth. They were first generation wealth. They didn't have family traditions. They didn't have these solid estates to pass on. They were sort of looking for what to do. And you had the rise of and the increasing dominance of these Enlightenment trends. So sociology, psychology, which offered the possibility of a more scientific approach to charity, right? So the idea that we don't just alleviate people's suffering, we use governance to discover the root causes of societal ills like poverty, which we can solve with this tremendous wealth. It's uncertain if that's happened. And then the two final factors I'd note are, there was a huge amount of societal upheaval in America at the time. This was the time when there was a transition from the agrarian society I mentioned to an urban, industrial, and professional one. There were huge waves of immigration into the United States via Ellis Island at the time. So you had this radical churn that uprooted this community-driven aspect of local love of brother to seeing these sort of great movements of people that did necessitate some kind of governance-like response. And that's really how charity got increasingly replaced by philanthropy. I think, unfortunately, what has happened now is that any distinction between those two conceptually in people's minds has been replaced. And people now think of philanthropy as the canonical expression of charity. And if you at least recognize that that's what you're doing and you do it intentionally and with the requisite knowledge, fair enough. But if you're a Christian and you believe that you're fulfilling your Christian duty by giving to the Gates Foundation in your will after your death, you're not. In fact, St. Basil the Great says explicitly that leaving riches to other parties after your death is not charity, because you're not giving away your money. Death is taking it away from you. You're not suffering, you're not sacrificing, you're not getting your hands dirty, you're not meeting your brother, you're not knowing and loving them. It's just a financial transaction. And I think, unfortunately, those trends have resulted in a huge amount of confusion. And so solving those kind of requires piecing together every aspect of the puzzle. What is charity? How can you pass on wealth to your children? How can you re-solidify your estates? And ultimately, how can you fulfill your charitable duty?